Hello, my name is Steve Triffletti. I'd like to welcome you to this edition of Plymouth Profiles. Plymouth Profiles is an opportunity to meet with people from the greater Plymouth community who are involved in our day-to-day lives. And today we're fortunate to have the newest member of our clergy group in the town of Plymouth, the newest pastor to the Church of the Pilgrimage. It is Reverend Tim Garvin-Leighton. Welcome, Reverend Tim.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you for being with us. And Tim, so you recently, we're taping this in May of 2024, and you recently came to the Church of the Pilgrimage a few months ago.
Yep.
I think we'd like to talk about your background. I mean, you're the newest religious and spiritual leader in the town of Plymouth. Tell us a little bit about your education.
Okay. I grew up, well, maybe we start a little before that. I grew up in Maine. Okay. So I'm a New Englander by birth and upbringing. And I spent my life. We okay? Okay. I was raised outside of Portland, Maine, and then went to college in Northwest Ohio, to Heidelberg, then Heidelberg College, now Heidelberg University. I always have to say that because you say Heidelberg University, immediately people think of Germany and that Heidelberg University, but anyway. And then from there, I went to the Peace Corps, and I was in Central Africa and the Congo for a couple of years as a Peace Corps volunteer. And then I returned to New England and did my Master's of Divinity at Andover Newton Theological School, which was in Newton Center at the time, and now is part of Yale Divinity School. So.
And I went to undergrad at Lutheran College in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, but is Heidelberg related to any particular group?
So the United Church of Christ, the same denomination that Church of the Pilgrimage is part of, and so it was founded by German Reformed immigrants that moved to Ohio in the early 1800s, and the Reformed Church became part of the United Church of Christ in the mid 20th century, and so it affiliated with itself then.
And a lot of people locally have gone to Andover Newton, local pastors
Yes.
and ministers, so it's familiar to many of us.
Yeah, and it's Andover Newton was the oldest freestanding theological school in the United States, and so it had a long history of educating local church pastors, particularly in New England, but it also had a long history of sending out missionaries across the globe and so forth. So it was a great institution.
So tell us a little bit about your interim time with the Peace Corps. Where was that, and what did that involve?
Okay, I was it was known then as Zaire. It had been a part of a Belgian colony, so it was the Belgian Congo at one point. And then when it gained independence in the 60s, first it was the Congo, and then they changed their name to Zaire, and now it's known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But it's literally the center of Africa, right on the equator. The equator cuts right through it, and I was about a degree north of the equator, and I was a water and sanitation technician. That sounds like a grand thing, but basically that was digging wells and building outhouses. And it was a wonderful experience, and I worked in a very rural, remote region, and so we had a sort of catchment area of about an area the size, well, the Congo itself is 1/3 the size of the United States, so east of the Mississippi, that's the size of the Congo. And the area that I was responsible for was probably the size of Massachusetts or bigger than that, and it had, and so it was a pretty large area.
And how did you happen to pick going there? Or did they decide where to send you?
No, the Peace Corps, so when you apply, you can sort of, I don't know if it's the same today, but when I applied, you could pick sort of geographical regions, and they had a whole, myriad of geographical regions you could pick, or you could say no preference at all, or you could just pick one, sort of one area. It wasn't country, so you couldn't pick a country, for example, but you could say Africa or Europe or Eastern Europe, or you could say Central or South America or something like that. And because I had studied some French on the Congo, the Western language in the Congo is French. So they do it the way the Peace Corps makes a decision, or if you have language skills, then what kind of program you're applying to. And because I was applying to the water and sanitation program, then they line up when you applied, when you get accepted, and what the next sort of group is leaving, and sort of that's how they do it. And so you can't actually pick a specific country. That may have changed in more modern times, but when I went in the late 80s after college, that's how the process was.
So when I was a child, I went to a church conference camp in New Hampshire that primarily drew from the inner city of Boston. Okay. I later worked there as a counselor and then as a director. But working with a demographic that was very different from Plymouth certainly helped shape my worldview towards lots of different things about people and issues. And I'm wondering, you're in Zaire in the middle of Africa. How do you think that helped, shape the Reverend Tim of today, looking back to that early experience?
Wow. No one's ever asked me that question.
Well,
so
I did.
There you go. So there's always a first, right? Well, I can say this. I've thought about it, and I've made reference to how it shaped me. As I said, I grew up in Maine. Maine, obviously, as many of you know, if you're familiar, is a predominantly white, state, and sort of, and most of the population came from, Western Europe, sort of ancestry from Western Europe. So and there's a very small African American population in Maine. So going to Central Africa was definitely, really stepping outside of my, sort of traditional zone of comfort in terms of demographics and so forth. But one of the things that became I lived in a rather small village. There was a mission station there, and the missionaries were Brethren missionaries, and they ran a hospital. But I lived in the village. And I had grown up going to congregational churches as a child, and we had done a lot of social justice stuff as a child in the churches. And so I had met missionaries that had been in Africa, and we had some relationships with some countries in Southern Africa. So I had met people in Western Africa as well. So I had met folks from Africa before, but I had never lived there, obviously, and had never been to the continent. And so one of the things that I began to realize after I was there for some time was I had never really understood certain aspects of the Bible. And one of them was really the sense of community first rather than individual first. Mm-hmm. So if you're at all sort of familiar, particularly with the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, the center of society is really the community rather than individual persons within the community. And when I got to the Congo, and after I went through training and got to my local village, it became clear to me right away that this was a society based on community first rather than individual first. And the needs of the community superseded the needs of the individual. And the Congo, at least where I was and when I lived there, was 90% of the people were agrarian, and they were subsistence farmers. And so having a population that's 90% subsistence farmers is also much closer to the biblical times where most people were agrarian folks. Even if they were city dwellers, they still lived in an agrarian sort of world. And so you see many of the metaphors in the Bible are metaphors about growing things and planting things. That all took on a new life for me in a way I had never imagined, because I hadn't lived in a place where that was the case. And so one of the things that I really have taken with me all these years later is I have a deeper understanding and appreciation for those kind of biblical texts and that sort of focus on family and community rather than individuals that we tend to be much more focused on in Western society. So that's one thing. I think the other thing, obviously, in communities where people are subsistence farmers, you're living very close to the edge. Everybody is, really on the edge of poverty, on the edge of survival, and so that also gave me a deep insight into sort of a different kind of poverty. I mean, we have poverty in America, and there are certainly endemic poverty in lots of communities. But I had never been in a place where everybody was sort of living on the edge of, non-existence, if you will, because if their crops didn't grow, their family failed, and these kind of things. And I really hadn't ever seen that. And so that gave me a deeper appreciation for what it meant to really live so close to the edge of survivability. But it also gave me a great appreciation of how people rallied together and supported one another, because everybody was in the same boat. And so therefore people tended to care for and share. I think I never experienced more sharing when I lived there, and I never experienced people more gracious and hospitable in that time. Even though they had almost nothing, their houses were open. They would feed you. The first thing, when you showed up, they wanted to make sure you had tea. They wanted to make sure you had food. And so I also saw that even though you could be severely economically disadvantaged, you could still be gracious hosts. You could still share the things that you had. And so that's helped me appreciate the things I have in my life as well.
I think I also found when I was in my camp setting with people from very different backgrounds and different races and national origin and religion and sexual orientation, everything, that I think now today it helps in a world where there's a lot of division at times, having great tolerance and patience for the things that make us different.
Well, and of course, I was the outsider in this kind of context, and I have a funny story to share, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
So this is I was one of the last groups of the Peace Corps. When I was in the Peace Corps, water and sanitation volunteers and public health volunteers in the Congo were given motorcycles. If you wanted a motorcycle, you could get a bicycle otherwise. But I got a motorcycle because I had a large area to cover, and so, and it was a dirt bike. It wasn't a road bike because all the roads were dirt. And I had been there, I don't know, about a year and something, and I was coming back from one of the villages where we were out doing some surveying to see what kind of water system we could make, and I crashed my motorcycle. And I was knocked unconscious. Now, you have to imagine, I had one of those full face, like you see people doing motocross helmets. I had one of those on, and thank God, because I'd be dead if I hadn't. But anyway, crashed my motorcycle, I was unconscious. When I came to, I had all these people standing around me, and I sort of got my senses, got myself untangled, got myself up. And it was really disoriented, but I remembered the name of the town where I lived. So I asked how to get there, and they gave me directions and told me, and I walked back to my motorcycle, and in between the space of the 10 feet from getting the directions, walking back to my motorcycle, I'd forgotten everything they told me. So I went back into the same thing, and finally, I sort of noticed, and I looked, and I saw everybody around me was black. And I looked at myself, and I saw I'm white. And I said to myself, what's wrong with me? I thought, where am I, and why am I the only white person here? I had short-term amnesia, and so I had lost all my memory. I didn't know I was in Central Africa, and so all I recognized was that there was something wrong with me because I was different than everybody else there. And finally, they told me to sit down, and they had sent Artie to get help. But in a day or so later, all my memory came back to me. But I still remember that now, that, and what what I was trying to grapple with is why I was so different than, and yes, I was, but I didn't know at that moment why. And so I've carried that with me because we do have these sort of cultural clashes, and often we're in situations where we're radically different than the rest of the people around us. And I didn't know how to react. I didn't know what to do. I just was panicked because I was different than everybody. And they seemed to be the normal folks, and I was the abnormal person in the group. And so, thankfully my memory came back. But
I think those are great experiences. I had a similar one insofar as at my undergrad we had a January semester, and I chose to do an urban studies in Wilmington, Delaware, and I lived for the month with an African-American family, and I interned at a high school. And again, everybody else was black except me. And it was a terrific experience because I had never really been in a situation where I was the minority. I was different.
Right.
And I thoroughly enjoyed it. Everybody was wonderful and gracious and accepting. And it really has held me, I think, in good stead over the years. Now, your Peace Corps stint ended. And how did you happen to then go to Andover-Newton?
So I just want to say one other thing about that. I think one of the real valuable things for me about being a minority in that context was that has helped me in ministry, because there have been many times in ministry where I've been the odd person out, if you will, the person that's different than the rest of the folks around me. And I've had to learn how to navigate, and so the Peace Corps gave me that skill again to navigate.
You don't really think about it.
No,
I mean, you're like different, like, okay, that's fine.
I did in that moment because I had amnesia,
but since then,
but no.
You learned.
Well, and when I got my senses back and I knew where I was. But anyway, I had already been accepted to seminary before I went into the Peace Corps. So this isn't in my little bio, so you don't have this little piece of information. So when I was preparing to graduate from Heidelberg, I already knew I was going into the ministry, or at least that was my plan. So I had applied to Andover-Newton, I had applied to Chicago Theological School, and to Princeton. And I had been accepted to all three schools. And then when I got accepted to the Peace Corps, I deferred my enrollment. And then when I came back from the Congo, I had a decision to make. Was I going to go to Chicago, or was I going to go to Princeton, or was I going to go to Andover-Newton? And so I went back and revisited all the schools, and in the end, all of them had really great opportunities, but the reason Andover-Newton won out was twofold. One, it was close to my family in Maine, and I had been away now for 6 years, 4 years in Ohio, and then 2 years in the Congo. So the opportunity to be close enough to drive home and see my family on a regular basis was certainly a big draw. But the other thing was, at that time, Andover-Newton was part of the Boston Theological Institute, which was the 13 graduate schools of theology, and the most diverse theological institute in the United States. So we had everything from the Greek Orthodox at the Hellenic College to Gordon Conwell, which is the evangelical seminary, and then the Jesuits and the diocesan seminary, and Boston College and Boston University and Andover-Newton. And that opportunity to be able to study at Harvard or Boston College or Boston University or Gordon Conwell or whatever was really appealing to me, because one of the things that I wanted to do in ministry was be connected to the ecumenical community. And while Chicago had a similar theological institute, it was not nearly as diverse, and the distances were greater too to commute between the schools. And so, the proximity to my family in Maine and that theological consortium made Andover-Newton the clear choice for me. And I took full advantage of it. I took classes at Harvard, I took classes at Boston University, at BC, and not only being able to go to those other schools and study there, but to have students from those various backgrounds, Catholic priests, people studying to be Catholic priests, and people studying to be Orthodox priests, and Lutheran pastors and an Episcopal, at that point, the Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge existed as well. All of those things really enriched my academic life, and it made lasting friendships across these theological boundaries. And much of my ministry and life in ministry has been about crossing those kind of boundaries and reaching out to people of various backgrounds. And so to be in a place that was so rich and had that opportunity really was, a leading factor. And I cherish the opportunity that I had in that,
Plymouth is certainly an interfaith community. We have Catholic Church and a synagogue and various groups, and so it seems as though that background is going to be helpful. And you've had some stints in the past doing pastoral work as well as being a chaplain, which I assume encompasses a lot of different areas. So would you say, again, that background at Andover Newton held you in good stead for some of these other things that you've done?
Well, yeah, I mean, one thing it certainly did. So I spent the first part of my life after seminary. I went to Miami, Florida, and was there for almost 6 years. And I was in a community that was a small community, and so we had a Catholic parish, an Episcopal church, and a Presbyterian church, and our congregation. And then there was eventually there was a small Jewish group that met in the community, and they actually had their services in our church. But I had great relationships with the clergy of all the rabbi and the other clergy from the churches. And of course, again, having that experience at Andover Newton and being in a community that already had many of that religious diversity present set me up for it. But it also made me open to be able to work with those folks, and it prepared me to be able to have dialogue with them and to do ministry and mission with them. And then after leaving Florida, I came back to New England and then was out in Colorado and then in Western Maryland for 8.5 years. And then I went into college chaplaincy, and I did that for the last decade, actually, before coming to Plymouth. And the first campus ministry I served was at UC Davis. And there, I was the Christian campus minister of the oldest campus ministry at UC Davis, but also the executive director of their multi-faith living community. And that multi-faith living community had 40 students that lived in intentional faith community. And they were Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Taoist, Wicca, atheist, agnostic, all living in an intentional faith community. You might say to yourself, well, why were atheists and agnostics living in an intentional faith community? And one thing I try to remind folks is everybody's looking for meaning and purpose. Right. Regardless of whether you believe there's a God out there or not, or you don't really understand what God might be, everybody is looking for meaning and purpose. And even students that are atheist and agnostic, so they may not have a concept of God or one that you and I might understand, but they're still looking for meaning and purpose. And they wanted to be in this intentional faith community because it was a community that, one, put them in contact and dialogue with their peers from all these religious backgrounds, but also it was a place that was giving students intentional meaning and purpose. We had small groups, we had interfaith meals and programming, and so this was a place where they could nourish and nurture their spiritual self, even if they weren't searching for God or some other kind of formalized religious expression. And again, if I hadn't had that experience at Andover Newton, this was certainly much deeper than whatever I did at Andover Newton, because I was, immersed on a daily basis with this wide diversity. But it gave Andover Newton and the religious diversity of the Boston Theological Institute gave me the experience and grounding to be able to dialogue with those folks. And it gave me the openness to actually want to be the campus minister to these students. If I had gone to a traditional seminary and just been with other Protestant Christians, I may not have even sought out that kind of experience. So.
I think in the United States, and really certainly in Plymouth, there's a lot of blending and blurring of lines when it comes to religious traditions. So,
Sure.
for example, when my parents moved to Plymouth, my father came from a Catholic tradition. He actually was raised in an orphanage by nuns. My mother came from a Protestant, and we ended up going to the UCC church. And so my father, raised a Catholic, spent his adult life in a Protestant church. And over the years, in our particular congregation, we've had many people from a Jewish tradition or a Catholic tradition being members of our church just because of a variety of reasons, family and so on. So, and it seems to work out great and people embrace it. And sometimes there might be some conflict with points of view on how to interpret certain things, but because of maybe their traditions they learned as a child, but it all seems to work. And it just seems as though your background lends itself to what we actually experience here in Plymouth.
Well, yeah, and I think, America is pluralistic. We have been from our founding. Right. I think one of the greatest things is that we have freedom of religion. And we know from history that there were Jewish and Muslim folks here at the beginning of, and obviously our Native American brothers and sisters were here before any of those folks were here. And so we were a pluralistic society at our outset, which is very different from our European ancestry, which was not very pluralistic. And so I think one of the things that is always challenging for Christians in particular, but for people that are of faith in general, is the pluralism of the American experience. It sometimes pushes those buttons and challenges folks in ways that they don't expect or understand. And I think one of the great things about our denomination, the United Church of Christ, is while we are decidedly Christian and a Christocentric denomination, we have the openness to embrace people of religious diversity. And we've had, my mother and I was baptized Catholic, and my mother sought refuge from the Catholic Church in the UCC when I was a small child, because the priest was, the parish they went to had a very forward-thinking priest. He was really a post-Vatican II person. He knew my mother was divorced. He knew that she was a single parent struggling and this kind of thing, and he never denied her the Eucharist, even though technically she shouldn't have been allowed to have Eucharist as a divorced person. But he understood that he didn't have the power to control God's grace, because he was really a forward-thinking priest. Sadly, he was killed in a skiing accident. Oh. The same kind of thing that happened to Sonny Bono. He was skiing and went off the trail and hit a tree, and he died. Wow. The assistant priest was elevated to the priest of the church. He was a pre-Vatican priest. Mm-hmm. First Sunday my mom shows up at Mass and goes up for the Eucharist, he denies her the Eucharist. My mom said, "We're not going back there anymore." And so our local family doctor was the organist at the Congregational Church. And so over the time, he got to know us more personally, because back then the doctors still did home visits and all this kind of stuff. And he would always say to my mom, "You really could come to our church. I know you're Catholic, but they'll welcome you." And she, "No, I can't," very, very much. And finally, after several years, she sort of said okay and went, and we showed up, and the UCC church embraced her. They embraced me. They didn't care that she had come from a Catholic tradition, and that was it. That began our journey in the UCC, and it really marks the same kind of thing.
Sure. You've done a lot of outreach work and education in your life, and some of it is directly dovetails with some of the things we do here in Plymouth, Mission to Homeless or to Habitat for Humanity. Tell us a little bit about some of these experiences you've had.
Yeah, so Habitat has been something that has been a long-standing ministry and mission priority for me, shall we say. In fact, the first church I pastored in Miami, Florida, we built and sponsored 3 Habitat houses. And somehow, I still to this day don't know how it happened. So originally, the 4 churches in our community agreed to sponsor the house. And someone decided, because I was the youngest guy, meaning age-wise, not necessarily the newest clergy person in town, but I was the youngest person chronologically, that I would be in charge of coordinating this. So that led me to sort of be the titular head of organizing this and getting the volunteers from our churches. So we did that, and we built this house in one of the inner city neighborhoods in Miami. And then folks in the association, in the Miami-Dade Association of the UCC, got wind that we were doing that, and they said, oh, gee, well, we'd like to, as an association, sponsor a house. Why don't you coordinate? All of a sudden, I was now coordinating 300 volunteers at 10 different churches to go out and build a Habitat house. And we ended up building 2 more houses, and I spent 2.5 years every Saturday swinging a hammer, rain, sun, no sleet, because it was South Florida, building 3 Habitat houses. And we, we made great connections. In fact, the first family that we built a house for, they started attending our church, and their son, he was a drummer, he was an aspiring drummer, and we had just started a sort of alternative worship service with a band. He became the drummer in the band for our alternative worship service. That sort of led me down a road to making a covenant with every church that I pastored after that, that we would be intentionally engaged in some kind of local mission and some kind of overseas mission. Because I felt that it was important that we had an investment in our local community and mission. And so Habitat often became that local mission. It wasn't always the case, but that was one of them. And then we'd have some overseas kind of mission. In the last church I was serving before I went into campus ministry, which was in Western Maryland, the association had a long-standing partnership in Honduras. And so we started I went down to Honduras on 4 different occasions. And so there we built houses. We had an educational ministry, so we supported students in their educational endeavors. I think we had 300 students that we were supporting in their attainment of education. And over the 20, I think they were about 20 years, they were going to Honduras. I think they built 30 houses in about a 20-year period for families. And so, I think for me, it's great to gather in worship, and that's central and gives our spiritual formation and identity. But then we have to move that out into the community and show God's love to the world. And we often do that through these kind of mission projects.
And I wonder, was Honduras one of your favorite destinations to do mission work?
No, it was a great place. It just was coincidental that was, I know why you're asking that with a little smile on your face. So my wife is Honduran,
yes,
and born and raised there. But we never met while I was going to Honduras.
All right, okay.
And it was the last trip we took to Honduras that my best friend in Honduras happened to be her boss.
Okay.
And I got back to the States, and he sends me a message. Hey, one of my coworkers, they worked for a multinational company, so everybody there had to speak English, is really interested in the mission project you all have been engaged in. And she'd love to help out, like next time you're down here, to be a translator or do whatever. can I share your contact information with her? And I said, sure. And I trusted Byron. I trust him with my life. So I knew this wasn't some kind of like, he wasn't trying to set me up for anything or whatever. This was all in the up and up. And then, this woman and I started chatting online, and, one thing led to another. Our chatting became phone calls and then video calls. And then all of a sudden she said, well, I'm thinking about moving to Germany. And I said, why are you going to move to Germany? Why don't you come to the United States and let's meet in person and see where this might go? So she changed her plane ticket. She was already set to move to Germany and start a new life in Germany. She changed it and flew to Maryland. And as they say, the rest is history. But, it really started because Byron, who is my dear friend, had sort of, but we had never met when I was in Honduras. So.
And now you're together.
And now we've been together almost a decade.
Yeah, that's terrific.
Yeah.
I also understand that you worked with people with AIDS and the homeless.
Yep. Yeah. So I worked 6 years. I did some interim ministry. So I wasn't always doing full-time called sort of settled pastorate. I did some interim ministry, and while I was doing that interim ministry, I got a job as what they call it was basically a case manager at an AIDS service organization in New Hampshire, and I did that for 6 years.
We often think up in New England, well, we're kind of insulated from all of this, and we're not.
No, I mean I worked with 3 different AIDS service organizations in New Hampshire. And, there were more than 300 clients in the, and those were just the folks that were clients. So they were sort of identified persons who were HIV positive. So there's considerably more folks. And you think of New Hampshire as, but no, and it was a wonderful experience. I was, like I said, I was a case manager. My particular job was to help people get connected to benefits. So housing benefits like Section 8, food stamps, Social Security, disability. So really what I was doing was what someone that works with poor folks or disabled folks or any of those sort of categories, helping them get connected to the benefits that they are entitled to because of their, disability or poverty status. And so I learned very intimately how to navigate those government bureaucracies. And so, homeless ministry, therefore, has been something that many of the churches that I've been a part of have connected to, more because I've lived in some communities where homelessness was pretty significant, but also because I had some knowledge on how to connect people to benefit systems and that kind of stuff, so it seemed like a natural fit as well.
So this year, 2024, you find yourself coming to Plymouth, and you're now a pastor here at the Church of the Pilgrimage. And in the letter to the congregation, there's language here about how ancient lessons can still provide guidance in the complex world, or that you can lead us to the future by still maintaining strong traditions, which we have strong traditions here, certainly in our church, in our community, a lot of history. So what would you say about that? I mean, we see so much going on nationally and internationally where there's conflict in the world and there's challenges with, religious traditions. How in Plymouth can we learn from some of the past as we move forward?
Well, I mean, the first thing is we can't be stuck in the past, okay? You're an attorney. So one of the things that always strikes me, and I bring this up because, we hear on the Supreme Court, there are what they call originalists, right? And I sort of frame originalists the same way I frame biblical literalists, okay? These folks that take the Bible literally and think they can read it without any context of the present situation and how society is organized and lives today. And I don't think that's possible.
I would agree.
And I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on TV either. But I think that the same framework it plays into it. Yes, the Bible has a particular context, and it had a particular meaning when it was written several thousands of years ago. The Constitution had a particular meaning and context when it was written 250-ish odd years ago. We don't live in those contexts anymore. We certainly seek inspiration and guidance from it, but we have to find ways to apply the text to the context we live in today. And that means understanding and living into the world that we live in today, and recognizing that these folks were writing about a time that they understood and lived in, and they were grappling with it. And so one of the things that I think is important is that we make sure that we protect our history and guard it, because it shaped our identities, right? And it is who we are. That's where we came from. But we can't be stuck or beholden to the past. And we have to make the past a living present. And we do that by adding our own voice and our own understanding to these contexts. And so I think, I haven't lived in Plymouth long enough to understand all the particulars, but certainly, the Pilgrim fathers and mothers and the Mayflower and that heritage are a reality for this community, and we have to deal with it. But we also have to deal with the consequences that evolve from that, right? And we have to understand that our Native American brothers and sisters were here before, and they have a particular identity and understanding to this land that we both call home now. And we have to see and understand this land through not just our eyes, but their eyes as well, because their experience is a shared one, and it's one that can shape our identity going forward. And I think it can make a richer and more full identity. I think the other thing is that the Bible, to me, is a living document, because God is alive. God's word is alive. And back to the Constitution, I think the Constitution is a living document too. And so if we treat these as static documents, that's the danger in where we fall into trying to shape our current situation and fit it into the box of the past. And I think that's the danger. But if we can use them as living documents, and we can see that they're breathing life and dynamism into the world we're in today, then they can be part of who we are and help us shape a future that's more wholesome and more blessed, I think.
It's so true, really, in the legal system. Right here in Plymouth, we have a probate court with 4 to 5 judges at any one time, and you talk about originalists and literalists. They're all different, and you almost need to know which judge you're going to be before as to how a case might turn out, because they interpret the law, they apply the law differently.
Right.
And that's true certainly in the spiritual community here in Plymouth. But one of the great things that happened recently during COVID was that people pulled together as a community. And so we found that when we did a show here at PAC TV, every day we brought in clergy from all different traditions. Everybody pulled together with the common goal of trying to help out the community navigate through the COVID experience.
Right. And I think, it was the same after 9/11 too, right? We came together as a community and as a society, and that's back to what I was saying when I was in the Congo. I really experienced that sort of community togetherness in a shared vision and a shared goal. And so that's something that's I've carried that with me ever since I was in the Peace Corps, and it's been sort of central to my ministry of trying to understand community as a shared goal and a lived experience where, we're in this together. It's not me and it's not you, it's us.
So in the short time you've been here, in addition to being the pastor at Church of the Pilgrimage. You've done some community work. I invited you to come to our town meeting, and you gave both the
you
invitation.
didn't tell me it was 8 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday.
And you came and you did the invocation, and you did also a remembrance of those people who had passed on, and it was very well received. In fact, you were quoted at a subsequent session of town meeting when we were debating the issue of homelessness. So tell me how you viewed your role as a spiritual religious leader in the community coming before this governmental gathering of elected officials.
Yeah, so, I can say this, I'm not a fan of civil religion, and I've always been very suspicious of civil religion. But I think as people of faith, and this comes from seminary and and then I developed a class called Public Theology when I was at Piedmont University, which is where I was at before I came to Plymouth. And the course on public theology is really about a religious person's responsibility in the public square. And so back to our identity and our Constitution and our freedom of religion means that we have the ability to speak truth to power. And religious folks should not be afraid to bring their faith and their tradition into the public square for dialogue. And so I see myself as an interlocutor in that community, and I have a responsibility to be a spiritual leader to the public officials and of a community and the political leadership. That doesn't mean, however, that I have a right to insist upon my religious values being the governmental authority or, the policies that are shaped. But in this one particular example, I think what is helpful is when we can bring a sense of a larger understanding and an awareness to the marginalized in our communities. And I think religious communities have historically been good at doing that. And so I was glad to hear that my prayer in the inclusion of marginalized folks in my prayer got people to think more broadly about how we do that in Plymouth, and particularly around the issue of homelessness. And I think that's a good example of how myself as a religious leader or the other religious leaders can be part of those kind of spaces and are essential to it. And that's what I think our founding fathers and mothers and our ancestors meant when they talked about, that. And that's what I think about the public square. And that's the space I think, it's a fine line though, because the danger becomes, okay, now I was quoted and it helped sway at least a few folks, whether it changed the vote or not, who knows. But the danger becomes, well, gee, now I should show up and talk about other issues, and that's not, I don't think that's the role I play. I play a role to be an interlocutor and a person to share the insight and say, why don't we consider this? Here's a way to talk about this,
Another community gathering in which you were involved was more of a religious experience, and that being the Easter sunrise service. So that's a gathering of Christians, but not necessarily people just from your congregation. It's more of an ecumenical experience. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was great. So it was up on Cole Hill. It was early earlier
than town meeting.
It was earlier than town meeting, but I'm a morning person, so. And it was the sunrise service. It actually could have been a little later because of the time of sunrise, but it was a beautiful experience, and we had the weather was perfect. And I don't take any credit for that, but it was wonderful morning. And to me, it was inspirational, the location overlooking the harbor, and just the sun coming over, but also the folks that came out in the morning to be there. Some had been out walking their dog and just showed up, and other people had planned to be there. And to me, that's part of what church is really. It's organic, it's spontaneous, but it also is planned. And that was really what that service was. we had a planned service, we had a time set, and we knew what we were doing, but then there was a lot of spontaneity that took place, and there was a lot of organic, sort of syncretism that happened in that moment with people just sort of wandering up and showing up and coming. And I like that, and it was great. That was week one of me being at the church. It was the end of week one, so it was pretty action-packed that first week at the church. But it was really a beautiful way to celebrate Easter, and it reminded me of the things that I miss about living in New England, because the sunrise service has always been something special to me, actually, and so. It was a great way to start.
Plymouth is a large community. It's eclectic in many ways. And I'm wondering how you see yourself interacting with other spiritual leaders in the community, whether participating in interfaith council or joining together with other people who are religious leaders in order to try to, as a group, help our community.
Yeah, so I've participated in one of the Interfaith Clergy Association meetings, which is not all of the clergy in town, but a number of them. And because of that, last night there was the Holocaust Remembrance service at the synagogue, and I went, and there were a number of the religious leaders from the different communities that participated. I just was there to be part of the congregation and support our Jewish brothers and sisters, but it was a really powerful service, and it was great to be part of that community and to be able to be, there to support our Jewish brothers and sisters, particularly at this time and moment, in the context of what's going on in the Middle East and in Israel and Gaza in particular. But I'm hoping as I get more connected and more involved with the other clergy in town and the other religious leaders, that we'll be able to work on some mission projects together. There's a lot of places where we can have common alliances and work for the good of the community. And there are also ways we can hold worship services and sponsor things, religious education opportunities that are interfaith and these kind of things. And I'm hoping to have those opportunities because I think they're important for our community.
So we've talked a lot about your background and some of the experiences you have and a little bit about now coming to Plymouth, but looking forward to the future. And I know it's kind of early, but have you seen yet anything that would lead you to be able to articulate certain goals or wishes that you might like to achieve while you're here in Plymouth?
More bike lanes. I say that I'm a cyclist, sometimes an avid cyclist, mostly just a cyclist that enjoys to be out on the bicycle. But no, seriously, I definitely think that, now that the community has allocated these resources to build family shelter, I think there's ways that we certainly can work as a community with that. And I know there's still the ongoing need with our immigrants that were displaced and sort of shipped here, if you will, not to their own accord. And we can certainly work with those populations. And I know that our church has been involved with Habitat, and I hope to continue that ministry. But one area I think our church had a long history of doing overseas missions in the past. And that COVID sort of messed that up like it did for many folks and in many things. And I'm hoping that we can revive some kind of overseas missions. And then I think the last thing is there's a lot of young folks and young people moving to Plymouth, which probably is something that was not true in the past. As housing prices become more expensive in Metro Boston, we're becoming a bedroom community, right, for certain groups of folks, and how the church might be able to engage those folks that are moving here in what kind of programming. I think there's a great need for that, and what we can do to offer that community, and particularly high school age and college age folks that are living in our community.
It's certainly, you and I have talked about it, the demographic's a little different. You're actually probably one of the youngest people in our congregation, that many of the people in the congregation are older, just like at town meeting. We made that observation as well. So that's certainly an area in terms of outreach for not only the 55-plus community, but people who are younger.
Well, and I think one of the things is, if you're commuting to Boston or close to Boston for work, you're going to have less time to, here in Plymouth. But there might be ways where we can create programming that still can engage people, even if they're not necessarily coming to church on a regular basis. And so I hope that we can find some ways to do that. And
So Tim, we've talked a little bit about you professionally and in terms of your thinking and philosophy. But personally, you mentioned cycling and bike lanes. But what do you like to do in your free time when you're not out there? And again, that's hard to say because I know as a pastor, it's really 24/7. But having said that, what do you like to do in your free time?
Yeah, so I love to travel. I've been to, I think, 28 countries now. So, and there's a lot more I'd like to visit. So I hope to keep traveling as long as I can. I do like cycling, and I love the ocean. And really, for me, the ocean is the place that renews me. It's always been a spiritual place for me. I grew up not too far from the ocean in Maine, and the Atlantic in particular has always been a sort of spiritual place for me. And so spending time at the ocean is definitely an important thing. And I actually like to go in the winter when there are less people there. I said that to my wife, who's from Honduras and from the Caribbean side of Honduras. So she's like, why do you want to go to the ocean in the winter? You can't swim. And I said, well, it's not really about swimming in the North Atlantic anyway. It's really about the solaceness, the energy and all of that. So we like the outdoors. Both of us are active. We like hiking. So, Miles Standish, the forest is there. It'll be great also being closer to Maine. I'll be able to spend more time with the family that still lives in Maine, so I'm looking forward to that.
So one last question for somebody that might have just joined us halfway through, didn't hear the whole presentation. What's the one thing you'd like people to remember who watched this presentation?
If you want to come and know more about what we're doing in a dynamic place that really has an amazing amount of opportunities and does an amazing amount of things in the community, come to Church of the Pilgrimage. Check us out. Don't be put off by our archaic website. We're a dynamic place, and we have dynamic people, and there's a lot going on there, and I'd really like to welcome you.
Good. Reverend Tim Garvin-Leighton.
Thank you.
Thank you for being our guest today.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for all of you for joining us to this presentation of Plymouth Profiles. Please come back and visit with us for future presentations. My name is Steve Triffletti. Thank you for joining us.